Warm welcome, everyone, to the conversation on housing, sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Berkeley, Albany, and Emeryville. I'm Ruby McDonald, president of the League. Before we get into the program, we'd like to invite everyone who's not yet a member of the League to join and become a member either on our website with a credit card or sending a check to our office. That information will be in the chat. For over 100 years, the League has been involved in registering voters and advising them on the issues. And we all know that in the last 4 years, voting has really become even more important. So it would be great if you would like to join. And thank you. So on to the program. Conversation on housing. Why housing? I guess we are all aware that California is a leader, sadly, in levels of poverty, which are driving homelessness to greater and greater heights, and increasing in numbers of tenants in distress over rent. So it's particularly important in this time of housing turmoil increased by COVID-19 for us to really pay attention to this important issue. Now, according to the polls, as you probably know, Californians are most worried about this housing crisis and homelessness. And there are many elected officials, some represented here, nonprofit organizations, community organizations who have been working very hard to try to do something about this terrible situation. So that's what the League also is, has made it one of their priorities to try to do something and supporting legislation of various kinds. If you go to the League website, the League of California, you will see those bills which are supported by the state league. So just to make it clear, the League, contrary to perhaps some opinion, is not neutral. The League studies issues and takes positions to adopt priorities for certain actions. So although we hope we are fair, we are not neutral. And therefore, it's important for us to have these kinds of events. There are two types of activities that the League pursues with their priorities. One is advocacy, and I just mentioned that, for instance, the State League supports bills. The second is education, and those priorities then we try to educate the public on, and this event tonight, Conversation on Housing, is one of those educational events. So although this event is not like the usual, I think people are more familiar with candidate forums where there's strict timing and ground rules. We hope that this will be more like a real conversation. However, of course, with fairness and civility so that we can have as productive a conversation as possible. Now, we are, because this is a large webinar, only the panelists, Senator Wiener and I are being observed, but the audience is encouraged, if they would like to ask questions, submit the questions to the Q&A, and our league volunteer sorters will review those questions, and towards the end of the program, they will be addressed to the panelists who is appropriately who will be appropriately answering them. Finally, this program, it's a little complicated, consists of 5 parts. The first will be a 15-minute keynote overview by Senator Wiener on how the housing crisis got to this situation and what is going on now to remedy it, what remedies are likely to work, but also what voters can do to help become involved and be part of the solution. Second part will be the panel introducing themselves, describing their connection with the housing problem, those challenges and needs that they particularly feel are important, and also for transparency, if they could say where their funding comes from for campaigning or support of projects. The third will be a 5-minute for each person, each panelist, 5-minute question and answer, in which I will ask some questions, about the particular areas of your expertise with relation to housing. That then will be the third section. The fourth, we have a number of statements which have been passed around by email, which really should be clarified. In this time, it's very easy, especially with a subject like housing, for misimpressions. At any rate, those need to be cleared up, and that will be the fourth type of question. And finally, we'll go to the questions from the audience through the Q&A. If there are questions at any time, please let me know. Okay, we're ready to start and hope we enjoy. It's a great pleasure to introduce Senator Scott Wiener from District 11 in our neighboring San Francisco, who is likely to be the acknowledged leader on many legislative matters in the state Senate. Certainly housing is one of them, so that his colleagues, the press, voters, and even some think tanks have acknowledged Senator Wiener as a leader in his area. He will give the keynote overview, as I mentioned, describing the origins of this problem and the current legislative measures that are being taken to try to solve this dire situation at the local level. And also perhaps to tell voters what we can do about helping this process along. So Senator Wiener, to you.
Great, Ruby, thank you so much, excuse me, for that introduction. And thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me tonight. And first of all, I want to start off by thanking the League when we were pursuing Senate Bill 50, which although it didn't pass, I think really helped reshape the conversation around housing in California. The California League of Women Voters supported SB 50, and that was a significant endorsement for us. And it was a very large and diverse coalition, but having the League on board was just very impactful because it's an organization that is so respected. It's considered a very neutral arbiter in many ways of looking at policies on the merits. And the League took a look at SB 50 and supported it. I'll always remember that. I'm very appreciative of that. And I also want to thank and congratulate Mayor Arreguín and Vice Mayor Droste for your leadership and the Berkeley City Council's leadership in taking steps towards citywide fourplex zoning. That was especially, I think, in addition to a real world impact, it has a not symbolic, but a emotional impact, because Berkeley was an early adopter of exclusionary zoning. And so for Berkeley to be an early adopter of moving towards fourplex zoning is very meaningful and impactful. So congratulations. And Berkeley, fortunately, is in good company. The Sacramento City Council a month or two ago voted unanimously, and that's a very diverse city council politically, but unanimously to move towards citywide fourplex zoning. And now a city where I represent 1/4 of the city, South San Francisco, I share it with Senator Josh Becker, their city council took the initial step towards exploring and moving towards citywide fourplex zoning. So I like to razz my own amazing city of San Francisco. I love San Francisco with all of my heart and all of my soul. It's my home of almost 25 years. But San Francisco needs to move along with Berkeley and Sacramento and South San Francisco to citywide fourplex zoning. So we are living in really hard and really challenging times in this pandemic. I don't need to tell everyone listening what disaster this has been for our planet, and more than 500,000 Americans, millions around the world, so many people sick, losing jobs, so many changes, bad changes, but also hopefully some good changes around acknowledging the need for better public health infrastructure and for improvements, severe improvements to racial equity in healthcare and education and so on and so forth, and all of the lack of a social safety net, and hopefully we'll improve that. So a lot of changes, and hopefully there will be some good changes coming out of this, and that's a test for our society, whether we acknowledge the problems that COVID put a spotlight on, and whether we will fix those and make our world a more equitable place. But I'll tell you one thing that has not changed, that COVID did not change at all, not one iota, is the need for more housing. Before COVID, we had a severe housing shortage and there wasn't enough housing for everyone who needed it. During COVID, same thing, and after COVID, we will continue to have a severe housing shortage. There's been a lot of talk about, well, now that everyone's going to work from home, which is not true, that is false. Some people will work from home more than before, but it has been, I think the permanency of global working from home has been dramatically overstated. But the argument goes, because more people will work from home more days a week than before, which I think is true. Therefore, we don't need to build more homes in places like San Francisco or Berkeley or Palo Alto or San Rafael, because I guess everyone's going to live on top of magic mountaintop somewhere. They're going to be like isolated on top of a mountain. We don't need to have housing for them anymore. It's a nonsensical argument that falls apart with the slightest bit of scrutiny, because it actually, whether someone is working in the office 5 days a week, 2 days a week, or 0 days a week, they still need a place to stay. And so we have a choice, which was the same choice we had before COVID, is, are we going to prioritize having enough housing for everyone, housing of every variety? And if so, where are we going to put it? And are we going to continue to build sprawl and push housing into wildfire zones? Or are we going to put it in the most climate sustainable location possible, which is infill housing, near where the transit is, near where the jobs are, and so forth, that have walkable, bikeable, transitable, that's a word, neighborhoods? That's the same question as before. And I think, to me, the answer is the same. The answer is we need more housing, ranging from housing for our lowest income residents to the middle class, to everyone. And we should put it in an environmentally sustainable location, and stop with a pro-sprawl, pro-wildfire housing policy. And that's the work that I think we're all doing, and it's happening in the East Bay, it's happening in San Francisco, it's happening everywhere. So how did we get here? California used to do it the old-fashioned way. We built, as population grew, as more people came, we built housing for them, and we made it really easy to build housing. And as of the 50s and early 60s, California, the state of 15 million people, was building about 250 to 330,000 homes per year. State, 15 million people. Fast forward, pre-COVID, state of 40 million people, and we were building about 80 to 100,000 units a year. So almost triple the size, but our housing production had collapsed by almost 75%. So when you ask yourself, why is it that California has 13% of the nation's population, but 25% of the homeless population? Is that just random? Is that because someone's mad at California? Is that because of the weather? No, it's because we have deprioritized housing, whether it's market rate housing, whether it is subsidized housing for our lowest income residents. We have dug ourselves into this hole, and it cascades down. In San Francisco, it wasn't that long ago that if you were someone who was impoverished living on a disability check, you could afford an SRO in San Francisco. That was enough. And it was not the fanciest of housing. I'm not saying it was the best housing ever, but it was a roof over your head. It was a dignified way to live. Those SROs right before COVID were renting for $1,500 plus a month. And so it was now restaurant workers and retail workers, Starbucks workers living in those homes because they couldn't afford more traditional apartments. And so we used to build the housing, we don't. So how did we get here? We got here by, over decades, adopting very anti-housing policies designed to make it hard or impossible to build enough housing. And that's what we're trying to unpeel right now. So we did it through zoning. We did it starting really in the 70s into the 80s, just dramatically downzoning, taking huge swaths of our cities and saying, you are no longer allowed to build apartment buildings here. You can only build one home per parcel. LA did it even more severely in the 80s. LA literally, through a ballot measure, deleted 1/2 of its zoned housing capacity. Went from 10 million to 5 million overnight. We did it in San Francisco by downzoning. You look in places like the Sunset or Noe Valley or Pacific Heights, areas that are now zoned for single family or maybe 2 or 3 units. And you see these older apartment buildings, often beautiful apartment buildings. It's a lot of our rent controlled housing stock of 10, 20, 30 units. And you're like, why is this here? Well, before the 60s or 70s, it was legal to build those apartment buildings. And then we made it illegal. And we did that dramatically around California to the point where 70+% of the residentially zoned land in California, it's illegal to build anything other than a single family home, even if you're in a job center, by a train station, et cetera. And it becomes a math problem at some point that zoning is fundamentally, what is it legal to build and where? And when we say for 80% of San Jose or 85% of San Jose, you can only build one home per parcel, that quickly becomes a math problem in terms of actually being able to build enough housing. we also did it by not just through the technical like height and number of units you're allowed to build. We also, cities found tricks to say, well, we're going to say that you can build this number of units on this parcel, but we're going to adopt other means of making that impossible. So something known as floor area ratio, or FAR, where basically caps the square footage you can build. So a town can say, you can build 10 units. Our general plan will say you can build 10 units in this parcel, but the floor area ratio, the square footage cap, is so restrictive that you really can't feasibly build anything other than a single family home. Or they adopted really large lot sizes, like, you know, massive minimum lot size requirements. And in the East Bay, we look at a place like Piedmont or other places where you have these mega massive lot sizes, which were designed to prevent enough housing from being built and for it to be more affordable. And we know there's a history with land use decisions to try to keep people of color and low income people out of communities. That's why single family home zoning was invented, but also minimum lot sizes. Because if you can't afford a home on a minimum lot, 2-acre lot size, you're not welcome here. And you certainly, it's very hard to build small multi-unit on big lot sizes because it doesn't pencil out. Cities also found ways, and assisted by the state, say, okay, even when we zone for enough housing, if you propose the housing that we've said you can build, we're going to make you go through a multi-year or maybe even 5 or 10-year process to get that housing approved. So we know we said we're zoning this for 10 units, but you're going to have to go through a 4-year process. And in the end, we might actually cut it in half and tell you that you can only build 5 units. So for someone trying to build housing, whether you're a market rate developer, small builder, an affordable housing nonprofit builder, you couldn't even say, okay, here are the rules. I'm going to comply with the rules. It's like, then the response is, so what? You comply with the rules. We're going to make up new rules as we go along, changing the rules in the middle of the game. And that's what housing policy became, California. Then we, as the federal government withdrew from public housing and public subsidies of housing, California did as well. And then we ultimately killed redevelopment without replacing it with something to help cities fund affordable housing. So the whole notion of subsidizing housing for our lowest income residents started evaporating in California. We also, as of course, with the shortage of housing, put enormous pressure on rents. And it's interesting when you look at rent control in the 20th century. We, as anyone has followed the history knows, after World War II, there was national rent control in the U.S. And ultimately, state by state, it started going away. It went away in California, I think, mostly like by the early 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. And when did the rent control movement in California really start building again? It's in the 1970s, right? That's when it started building, and ultimately in places like Berkeley and San Francisco by the late 70s, early 80s, rent control was adopted. Well, why did it start building in the 1970s? What else happened in the 1970s? We started downzoning. We started letting people have tools to slow down and stop housing production. So rents started going up. So we started protecting renters, which I support, and I support rent control. But as you're doing rent control, you also have to deal with the fundamental issue of the overall supply of housing, which we never dealt with. So we for many, many years, we just allowed this to happen. We allowed this just situation to unravel, and the state sat by and watched as cities had this race to the bottom. Who could downzone the most? Who could make it the hardest to build housing? And we passed some laws in the 80s that really had no teeth. The housing element, which, having gone through the housing element process as a local elected official, it was just a horrible process because it was like pitched warfare, and then nothing actually happened pursuant to the housing element. We did the RHNA process, the affordable housing density bonus, the requirement for cities to allow ADUs. This is all around the 80s, and they had no teeth, and most cities just ignored them. In the last 5 or 6 years, the state has finally recognized that housing cannot just be a pure local issue. Just like education, we have local school boards, but it's not a pure local issue. We have an education code with minimum number of days and subjects taught and who's qualified as a teacher. We can argue about what should or shouldn't be in the education code, but most people would acknowledge you should have an education code because it shouldn't depend on where you're living in terms of what kind of education your kids get. It happens that way because of funding, and that's an issue we need to deal with. But we at least, in theory, say we want to have some consistency in public education. Same is true of housing, that there need to be stronger standards within which cities operate because we're all in this together. And we have to stop the race to the bottom. And so over the last 5 or 6 years, the legislature has gradually been first putting teeth into long-standing housing laws. We put teeth. It took us like 5 tries. We finally, the ADU laws, like it's like when we say it, we mean it. You have to let people put ADUs in, and I think we're pretty much at the point where we've closed, I hope, all of the loopholes. The Housing Accountability Act, which they refer to as the anti-NIMBY law, passed in the 80s. I refer to it as a "don't change the rules in the middle of the game" law. That if you've adopted the zoning and other rules, you can't arbitrarily not let people utilize those rules. If you zone for 20 units, you have to allow 20 units. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game. The affordable housing density bonus, which has become much more robust and has been strengthened, which was a dead letter for a long time. And then we've built beyond that. We've adopted more streamlining to say we should have more ministerial approvals, that if you've met all the criteria, you just get your permit, no discretionary processes. And so I authored Senate Bill 35, which provides that if you're in a city that's not meeting its housing goals, city housing is streamlined there. And if you zone for it, you have to let people, you have 3 to 6 months to give a permit for it. We're now considering, we're looking at zoning reform. SB 50 was the first big foray, but we now have legislation moving by Senator Atkins, our leader in the Senate, for statewide duplex and also facilitated lot splits. We are also trying to give cities more tools to rezone. So I'm authoring Senate Bill 10, and thank you. I think Berkeley City Council endorsed it in its previous form last year. Thank you for that, which is a voluntary tool for cities to say, okay, we're asking you to zone for more density. How about we make it easier for you to do that? So if a city wants to zone for up to 10-unit buildings in a non-sprawl area near transit jobs or infill, they can do that without going through CEQA. And we're also trying to really ramp up our support for affordable housing for our lowest income residents. We've done a lot of streamlining for supportive housing. SB 35 effectively streamlines 100% affordable housing statewide. There are almost no cities that meet their below market rate goals. So pretty much anywhere in California, SB 35 streamlines affordable housing. And the largest affordable housing builder in California, Bridge Housing, has told me that because of SB 35, their average time to entitle an affordable housing project has dropped from an average of 7 years to an average of 4 months. And I know that in Berkeley and Oakland and throughout the East Bay, we've seen some of these projects, and it's just terrific. We tried last year, I authored legislation to allow church land and some other nonprofit land to be converted to 100% affordable housing in a streamlined way. Unfortunately, there's now a war happening between the building trades and the affordable housing nonprofits, so that we had to pull back on that bill, but I'm praying that that dispute gets resolved. And we are increasing our funding for affordable housing. We had a bond on the ballot. We're trying to put another bond on the ballot for 2022. We have significantly increased general funding support for affordable housing. We've made a few different efforts to try to bring back a different version of redevelopment. Unfortunately, we've never had a governor that has really been supportive, and so we've been trying to muddle through that. And we've doubled the size of the low-income housing tax credit in California. So we also put a statewide rent cap in place in 2019, so that cities that don't have rent control, that renters at least have some level of protection, along with the just cause requirement. So there's an enormous amount of work remaining to be done, but I think we're finally slowly turning the ship around. But it's sad because, you know, I think in these housing fights, both the people who are scared of seeing more housing and don't want it, and the people who desperately want it, there's a perception that you pass a housing law and that homes just come down from the sky tomorrow or sprout up from the ground. And of course, it's not true. Housing is never as fast as we want. And so for those of us who want to see more of it, it just takes time. And so sometimes you get criticized. Well, you passed this big law 2 years ago and the problem still persists. I'm like, it took us 50 years to dig into this hole. We're not going to dig out of it overnight, but we are planting the seeds today so that over the coming years, and there are things happening quickly, but especially over the next 5, 10, 20 years, we can gradually right the ship. And so I'm optimistic. The polling shows throughout California that voters get it. Voters want more housing. Voters are okay with apartment buildings in their neighborhood. And I think we're going to get there. So let's just keep pushing along. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. Can we ask you a question before you have
Hey,
to rush off?
no, absolutely. I have some flexibility, so happy to answer some questions. And Jesse and Lori can jump in if I'm messing up.
Okay, since people are shy, I'm going to ask, what can voters do? Can they help move this process along?
Yeah, so I think a few things. Now, one thing that when we were in the middle of SB 50 and all the sort of energy pro and con around it, and I would sometimes have colleagues, especially in Southern California, who would say, you know, no one in my district supports this. Like, really, no one supports it? Like, absolutely no one. Yeah, no one's. That's because when you talk about who's coming to town halls, who is reaching out, it's all opposition and like anger and fear sometimes motivate people to come forward, as opposed to your content. You're like, oh, you read in here, oh, cool, I like that, you know, that they're moving this bill forward. You're not necessarily going to pick up the phone and be like, I like it, unless you're instigated to do that. And so I think this is just the nature of human psychology. Like, it's a little bit self-selecting sometimes. And so I think it's really, really important for people to tell their local elected officials and their state elected officials if you are in favor. Because we polled SB 50, well, we didn't, but other people did. There were 3 different statewide polls on SB 50 that all asked the question a little bit differently. Every single one showed support between 61 and 66%. Support in every region, even in LA, which was our hardest area politically. Support in every demographic. People of color supported it more than white people, but white people still supported it. Renters supported it more than homeowners, but homeowners still supported it. Younger supported it more than 50 and over, but 50 and over still supported it. And so it's really important for people to come forward and to tell their elected officials, you know, I'd like you to do this, or thank you for doing this, I have your back. And also just people really in these elections, whether it's for a city council or for a supervisor, for the legislature, or for mayor, asking them, really understanding where people stand on housing. People will sometimes say things, but it's really important to know, because we know that more and more pro-housing voices people are getting elected, particularly to state office, but also to local office. There are more city councils around in the East Bay and the Peninsula, in LA and suburban LA, areas where people have said, I'm for more housing, we need more housing, I'm going to support more housing, and they win. And that's what happened in South San Francisco. That council flipped. It wasn't even a coordinated effort. It was just like some pro-housing people ran and won, and now they're moving towards citywide fourplex. So I think that's the most important thing people can do: get involved in campaigns, hold people accountable, hold elected officials accountable, and tell people when you're happy that they're doing pro-housing things.
I have a quick question. What's a viable path towards Costa-Hawkins reform politically?
It's really, what's frustrating about it is it becomes this like either like either or repeal the whole thing or don't touch it. Um, and so uh, I think because of the two ballot measures that have gone down, that makes it really hard. I would like to see, I think a very common sense reform to Costa-Hawkins is to have the rolling 15 years. And just to do that as a standalone, doing that as a standalone, not with vacancy control, not with other stuff, just, the 15 years and maybe something about if you own more than a certain number of single family homes, it can be put into rent control. So there's the corporate ownership as opposed to, and I think and to me, that would be a very impactful and I think probably be slightly less of a reaction. I think vacancy control freaks a lot of people out. And so that's my take. I think there's going to be the opposition no matter what. But I think things have probably become clogged up in the legislature. I mean, the legislature still has not passed like just something as basic as you have to own a building for 5 years before you can Ellis Act it. I mean, that's like, to me, should not even be controversial. And yet it's never, Mark Leno got it out of the Senate once and then it promptly died in the Assembly. Usually it died in its first committee. It's been reintroduced this year and hopefully it'll be able to move forward. But, if something that basic has, struggles, it shows you how hard it is. Now, when the statewide rent cap just cause legislation passed, it didn't go as far as everyone wanted, but it was still a significant step. And it needs some fine tuning so that it's more enforceable. That was, the governor got involved, right? When the governor gets involved and it's like, we're doing this, we need to do this, then everything, everyone comes to the table and you can work through it. And so, this governor has had to deal with like the worst wildfires in California history and the collapse of PG&E and the pandemic, and now this ridiculous recall. And so, hoping when we get past this recall, we can get back to some tenant protections and some big housing production bills.
May I add something? Hello, Senator Wiener.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
Good to see you again, Paula.
It's really up to the will of the legislators to really actually change Costa-Hawkins, because it was the legislature who put Costa-Hawkins onto the people. And now it seems like legislators are afraid to make any real movement because if, sure, a 5% plus CPI cap may be good for some people, but, not all workers get 5% wage increases plus CPI. So it is still a crazy rent increase on people who don't get a lot of wage increases, because we see that wages are stagnant. So to say that the legislature isn't taking into consideration the tenants, the customers in this industry, it's an affordability crisis. We have a crisis of affordability. We have more people that are homeless because they cannot afford the rents. Costa-Hawkins allows, empty units, the rents on empty units to be raised to as high as the market will bear. And that's why we have in Berkeley, 40 plus year old units, that are going for $3,000. The average, medium rent for a 2-bedroom unit in Berkeley is $3,000. So it is up to you and and to stop the commodification of housing, and have leaders in the legislature and in the Senate to really look at what is happening with the way the prices of rents are in the Bay Area and everywhere. The rents have gone up in Sacramento incredibly. In the Inland Empire, rents have shot up everywhere. So it's not getting any cheaper. It's getting more expensive, and upzoning isn't going to make it any cheaper. We know that for a fact. Berkeley actually, built 128% of its RHNA numbers in market rate housing, and our numbers didn't go down. Our rents did not go down.
Well, I mean, I think a couple things on that last point. RHNA until now, RENA has been sort of a joke. My good friends in West Hollywood, I love West Hollywood, it's one of my favorite cities, fantastic city council. But I would always give them a little grief because they would say, we've always met our RENA. West Hollywood's RENA for an 8-year period was 120 units. Beverly Hills was 3. There were cities, the RENA was so low that I think the argument that, well, we met our RENA, so now we have new RENA because of a bill I authored, Senate Bill 828. It's causing tension, but it's good tension because it's actually going to say, let's have RENA goals that actually correlate with what we project housing demand will be. So I think it is absolutely not a sound argument to say, well, if meeting our old RENA didn't make housing costs go down, therefore upzoning doesn't work. I just fundamentally disagree with that. And so I think, we've never actually, for decades, tested the notion of if you add a lot more housing, do housing costs go down? We know that there are places that have added a lot more housing and housing costs have stabilized and even gone down. But here it's a theoretical argument because it actually hasn't happened. And one city is never going to, on its own, tank housing costs. It has to be a regional and statewide endeavor. And I agree with you that the legislature needs to do more for renters. We wanted the rent cap to be stronger, but we had to get to a majority, and it is not friendly terrain for renters in the California legislature. But I think it's gradually changing with the eviction moratorium that we put in place. We are able to do some things now that were impossible before, but we have to keep pushing.
Yeah, just to let you know, in Berkeley, between 2014 and 2019, Berkeley built 1,790 market rate units. That's 128% of our requirements for RENA. And it built 17 low-income units, so 4% of our RENA. And sure, we have now new numbers where we have to build some more, but we're not building. We haven't built enough. And I know Berkeley is now saddled with a huge increase, 9,000 units we have to build now. I'm not sure why Berkeley, which has done so much, has to be, Cleo agrees with me, my cat that's howling. We are saddled with a lot more units to build. And still we see that areas like Orinda don't have to build that much. So
yeah, so
very interesting.
We can agree on that. Orinda should be building more, but so no disrespect to Berkeley, I would say the same thing about San Francisco, but 1,700 units over 8 years is about 200 per year. And if you look at the magnitude of the hole that we're in, that's not going to move the dial. And so good on Berkeley for meeting its RENA, but I think, and San Francisco is going to see a higher RENA, and I criticize my own city for pushing back on the RENA. So, and I think the other thing I will say is we need to move away from this notion that housing is punishment for cities. Like housing, there's always this notion that, oh, we got higher RENA. It's like we're being punished. Housing is not a punishment. Housing is something that's essential to human existence, and we need every single kind of it, including for our lowest income residents. So 17, we need to increase that number, and we're trying to do that.
I just want to ask what your response is when people bring up the fact that quadplex zoning could increase the land price under the homes and lead to, massive speculation.
Well, first of all, land prices are really, really high right now. And I think we get like very contradictory arguments here. Some people will say, oh my God, you're going to ruin my home value by putting a fourplex in my neighborhood. And then, it's going to increase land values. So you're going to have 4 homes on that lot instead of 1. And so, yes, do you have a landowner who maybe is going to be able to make more money? Yes, but you're also going to now have 4 homes instead of 1 home potentially on that lot. And so it's 4 families who will have homes instead of the 1. And so I think a lot of times there is a focus on, oh my God, someone might benefit financially from a change in land use rules, and we can't let anyone benefit financially. I'm more focused on, are we going to have enough homes for people to live in, and everything else we can, if we want to have a land value recapture tax, or we can talk about that, and I'm open to that. But regardless of how we, manage that, job one is to make sure we have more housing for people to live in.
Another question? Well, we had some questions in the Q&A, but if anyone here has a question.
Well, sure. I want to focus on affordability.
Sorry,
I-
but could we could we give someone else a chance?
Ruby, can I just clarify?
Yeah.
Are you asking panelists if we have,
If you have a
if they have
question.
questions for,
Right.
for Senator Weiner? So, sure, I guess I'll ask. This is very nice to be able to hear from you. I guess my first question is, I think some people have some confusions around SB 10, and I was wondering if you can clarify, because I've received only a few, and I agree with you. I think the majority of people I run into in my day-to-day are very supportive of our housing affordability crisis, because it's affecting all of us. I'm sure every single one of us knows somebody who's suffering. And I just also want to highlight that I want to really make sure that we're centering around our shared values. I think, as you say, Scott, everybody gets really heated when we talk about this in a public setting, because we don't hear from people who have mild opinions, and that probably includes all of the panelists, but that we do have shared values. So I guess, in saying that, I have heard from people who I think are misunderstanding SB 10. And so can you walk us through SB 10 and what your aim is for that? Because my understanding is different, I think, than some other people's understanding.
Sure. So right now, if the city decides, hey, we want to rezone, we want to zone for more density, they have to go through, it could take years or a decade to do it, because they have to go through an entire EIR to CEQA, even if it's in an environmentally sustainable location. And what SB 10 does, it's purely voluntary. A city can ignore it, and then it has no impact at all in that city. But if the city council decides that it wants to participate, then the city council in non-sprawl areas. So, I mean, in Berkeley, it would probably be, most of the city, by transit, job center, or infill, the city council can zone for up to 10 unit buildings. It doesn't have to be 10 units. It can be 3 units, triplex or 4plex or 8plex or 10plex, or 10plex here and 3plex there. The city can do that and can decide where to do it or not do it. The city could say the whole city. I think most cities may or may not do that. Or they could say, we're going to focus on this part of town, or these 3 neighborhoods, or on these, roads. The city can just sculpt it to do what they want, anywhere from from 2 to 10 units, whatever height the city allows, anywhere the city wants to do it or not do it, or the city can just not participate at all. And they can do that rezoning without going through CEQA, because it's not going to be in a sprawl setting. And so they can do it much more quickly and efficiently. And so that's SB 10, a purely voluntary tool for cities.
May I add something about SB 10? And please, Senator Weiner, tell me if I'm incorrect, that it would allow the city council to override a voter-approved land protection initiatives. Can you explain that part about the law?
Yeah, so if the voters, for example, have said you're not allowed, like there are cities that are incapable of adopting housing elements because the voters have put in an initiative saying that zoning cannot be changed unless you go back to the voters. So there are literally cities in California that are incapable of adopting a housing element, and then they have to go through this very like Kafkaesque, like going to court, and it's just bad government at its worst. And so yeah, so this would allow the city council to do that if it's in an environmentally sustainable area.
Can you name any of the cities in the Bay Area? I think Albany would be impacted by that. Do you know any other cities here in the Bay Area that would be impacted by that?
Alameda, which has a prohibition on multi-family housing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, like when we look at some of the, California has a really ugly history of voter land use initiatives, going back to, for example, Article 34 of the California Constitution said that you can't build public housing unless you go to the voters to do that. Totally racist provision put in the Constitution in 1950. We're trying to get rid of that now. So I would just dispute that just because the voters have said this kind of housing is not allowed in our city, that often correlates to these kind of people are not allowed in our city. And so I think we have to take a balanced approach to that, and not just say, well, the voters have said that apartment buildings are banned here, so throw up our hands, can't do apartments here. And because the voters, you know, so yeah.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if we can start having the panelists speak up.
Great.
Maybe starting with the mayor, who's also the president of ABAG, since he is probably more invested in RHNA than anyone here. Mayor, would you like to, or president of ABAG, would you like to talk about RHNA?
Sure. Well, thank you to the League of Women Voters for having us. Housing is, I think, one of the most critical issues facing our state and certainly our region. And as Senator Wiener noted, we had a housing crisis before the pandemic, and it's even more acute thereafter. We have, you know, probably thousands of people throughout the Bay Area that are going to be facing significant housing insecurity at the end of this pandemic. And so while we need to focus on creating homes so that you know, residents have a place to live, we also have to support our existing tenants and make sure that they have the economic support to maintain their housing stability. I think that's an important part of our responsibility as government officials over the next few months as we're leaving this pandemic. You know, the issue of housing is very personal and important to me. I'm a lifelong tenant. Actually grew up in the city of San Francisco, and you know, on several occasions, my family faced eviction due to owner move-in evictions. And so I know what it's like to lose your housing and to face that, that fear and uncertainty about where you're going to live. And then, you know, it's also personal to me on a sort of a everyday level, as I am a millennial, and I definitely have the generation where I'm probably never going to be able to buy a single family home in my city unless we increase home ownership opportunities and provide opportunities for people to plant roots in their community. And so, you know, there are many people like myself who are struggling to find housing in Berkeley, in San Francisco, and throughout the Bay Area, and would like to be able to one day own a single family home. And so I really feel like I speak for tenants, I speak for people of my generation. Obviously, I speak for all people in the city of Berkeley. I think housing is one of the most important priorities for our community, as evidenced in multiple opinion polls that have been conducted. And I think the Berkeley community wants our city government to prioritize housing and to increase housing production throughout our city in a way that is equitable. And so in addition to my work as mayor of Berkeley, you know, I'm also honored to serve as president of the Association of Bay Area Governments. And as our regional council of governments, we are tasked every 8 years to determine the RHNA allocations for the San Francisco Bay Area. And so we're winding down what has been a 2-year extensive community process to allocate 441,000 homes to cities, towns, and counties throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. Berkeley, that allocation presently is around roughly 9,000 additional units that we have to plan for this 8-year cycle. And every community is seeing an increase as a result of increased allocations by the state of California. And so our responsibility is determine an allocation that's equitable, that affirmatively furthers fair housing. And I want to thank Senator Wiener for Senate Bill 828, which particularly made affirmatively furthering fair housing one metric that we have to meet in how we distribute housing goals throughout our regions. We know that the Bay Area has faced decades, generations of economic segregation. And so one of the things that we really try to prioritize in this RHNA process is to distribute housing, particularly lower income housing, and communities that have actively resisted building that housing historically, and to make sure that job-rich communities that have not built their share of housing, namely Cupertino, amongst other communities, is meeting their regional and statewide mandates to build more homes to address the growing demand that their increasing jobs are creating on their communities in the region. So jobs, housing, and balance, affirmatively furthering fair housing have been one of the key principles, and also equity underlying the RHNA that we've been working to implement. We are at the sort of midpoint of the process. We're waiting for the state to provide their comments on our RHNA allocation. Thereafter, local governments will have the ability to appeal their determinations, and we will make final approval of the RHNA in the fall. So happy to answer more specific RHNA questions, but RHNA is really where the rubber meets the road, and where each community has to not only plan for, but now has to permit homes to be able to address the regional housing crisis.
There was some interest for Berkeley. How do you handle the university housing in the RHNA allocation?
Well, certain types of student housing is counted and some isn't. Namely dormitory type housing is not, if it's university owned, is not counted. But we have a lot of group living accommodation buildings in Berkeley, multiple student households that are living in single family homes and apartment buildings. Those units are counted. And so, some portion of the, and also the university also has a variety of different housing types, not just basically dorm rooms, but also apartments, particularly for upper division students. Those units are also counted. So it really depends on the housing type. But at the present time, there are rules around what type of units can be counted for the RHNA. And I do think some portion of the university's increasing housing we will be able to count as part of that RHNA allocation.
It may be premature to ask this, but is it possible, or has it been considered that sanctions would be employed to persuade recalcitrant areas or cities to step up with their RHNA allocations?
Well, I think that the teeth, as Senator Wiener talked about, was Senate Bill 35. Up until Senate Bill 35, there was no real incentive for local governments to have to meet their RHNA mandates. It was just, you have to plan for it in your housing element, but there was no disincentive. Senate Bill 35 does say, if you do not meet certain benchmarks in terms of your market rate and affordable housing production, that projects will be ministerially approved by local governments. And so, if communities aren't meeting their benchmarks, then Senate Bill 35 will kick in. The city of Berkeley, we've met our above moderate income benchmark. And so SB 35 has been a very critical tool for us to streamline affordable housing production. And we have permitted roughly 400 units of permanently affordable housing now using SB 35. And it's an extremely important tool for local governments.
Janice, we haven't heard from you. Would you like to weigh in here?
So do you want me to, is it okay to ask questions or?
Sure, whatever you'd like.
Okay, great. So I would like to know why the university housing isn't all being counted. If the university is bringing in 40,000 or 50,000 students, and if they end up housing them, shouldn't that be counted toward our RHNA goals? And the other question I have is, why can't we, if we really want to count group living accommodations, why is our planning department allowing things like, some of these buildings to change their configuration so that developers can call themselves a residential hotel, for instance, and that doesn't count toward our RHNA goals when you're housing 42, bedrooms.
Well, I'm happy to try to answer that question. Some of this is what's prescribed in state law and the definition of what can be counted. And so, as I said, there are certain types of housing situations. Like, the university has several projects that provide apartment style living for their students. Those could be counted. But, basically multiple people living in a dorm room, for example, my understanding is that that would not be counted as a unit by state HCD. So if we wanted to kind of liberalize the standards in terms of whether dorm rooms would count, I think that would require state legislation. But there are certain types of housing through public-private partnerships the university is constructing that would and that could be counted for RHNA requirements. I think it's one thing I will say is that students aren't the only people that we need to build housing for in Berkeley. We have people that live in Berkeley right now and people that were coming to this region that need a place to live. And we shouldn't just say all 9,000 units that the university is building, that meets our RHNA requirement. That does nothing to address the broader regional housing crisis and the need that exists, not just in Berkeley, but in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Well, it just seems that if the university builds housing to house their students, then their students can move out of the apartments that they're living in now in our city.
I would argue that the university has not built nearly enough housing for the thousands of students that live in our community. Even meeting that 9,000 bed target that the university has set in its housing plan is nowhere near enough for the students that attend UC Berkeley. We have the lowest rate of student housing of any UC campus in the state of California.
Right.
And I'm glad that the chancellor has made this a priority, but we need to go beyond that, to be quite honest with you, to relieve the pressure on our regional housing market, which, as you know, has a broader affordability and displacement impact on other people in the city of Berkeley.
I'll also just interject there. Our colleges, our public colleges, UC, CSU, community colleges, really can't access most affordable housing funds. And so they have to build housing from their own resources. And that's something we should revisit. Of course, the pool of funding is not big enough. But as we gradually increase that pool, I think we should include the universities in terms of them building affordable housing for low-income students.
I do want to add that the University of Berkeley wants to demolish rent control housing, wants to displace affordable housing and tenants who have lived long-term in Berkeley, which is really upsetting that the university, in order to make way for market rate short-term housing for students, is willing to demolish a building that actually provides affordable housing for people. I mean, there's one tenant in 1921 Walnut Street has lived in their apartment for 25 years, and the university wants to demolish the building. So there's an imbalance there also that is really sad and very unfortunate. And we're hoping that the mayor, as the chair of ABAG, will exert some influence on the university with that power that he holds to make sure that the university does something so it doesn't have to demolish affordable housing and yet be able to, there's plenty of spaces where the university can actually build a short-term market rate housing for its students and not demolish affordable housing.
And one other question I want to bring up is there are more creative ways of bringing housing onto the market. And one of the things that Paola brought up before was vacancy rates. And, there's a lot of talk about how many units there are out there that are not currently being rented. And, I just did a little Google search before this conversation. And, there are new buildings that have so many vacant units that they're offering to, 1 and 2 months rent free to attract people to come, but they're not lowering the rates. The rents are the same. How can we, bring those units onto the market so that people can actually live in them?
Was that a question? Sorry.
Well, the question is, how can we get those units to be counted toward our arena goals? If there's a building that's been empty for a while, you know, and we get the landlord, we do something to get the landlord to rent them out. Shouldn't those new, you know, quote unquote, new units now count?
Well, there's no question. One way that you can actually meet your arena requirements is repurposing existing units that have not been on the market, or converting market rate housing into permanently affordable. Those acquisition and preservation projects do count for meeting some of the moderate or even low income arena requirements. So that is a strategy that local governments could pursue.
If you
Hi.
allow me,
So
if you,
I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to
Yes,
get back.
please.
I'm going to get back to introductions. Just say hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lori Drosty. I really appreciate having this conversation, and I look forward to having more of a back and forth. I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce myself and why I'm concerned about this issue, and address, I think at the very top, you asked us some questions. So, you know, first of all, I'll just say that, you know, I was fortunate enough to move to Berkeley in the 90s when I was 2. No, just kidding. When I was in my after college, and you know, I was drawn to this area because it was so diverse and wonderful and quirky, and it was just such a breath of fresh air that I hadn't experienced growing up in rural Ohio. And so Berkeley sort of represents to me, at the time I moved here, of a place that I think every community should be, someplace that's racially welcoming, economically welcoming. And it's been really sad, honestly, to see over the years, and it was starting to get this way when I first moved here, where we've seen our African American population dwindle in our community, where we've seen our younger generation priced out of our community, where we see empty nesters who may want to downsize and move into a place in the downtown, not have those abilities, as well as people getting evicted and people having to move away because they can't afford it. And not a week goes by where I don't hear a personal story. And again, I'm sure many people here have heard it from their friends too. And so that's why I just want to, I think the mayor has done a really good job in talking about our shared values, and that we may have different approaches in how we address this issue. But just last week, Jesse can attest that my son's best friend said they've got to leave because they can't afford to live here anymore, and they no longer, you know, their lease had expired, and they can't find a place. And it happens every month with somebody I know. And so we're trying to wrap our mind around this issue in a way that's equitable. And people have different opinions. And so I know that Karen has really been a real mentor to me in her work around anti-displacement, because I think for so long in the Bay Area, we've had this conversation around either you're pro tenant or you're pro housing, and there hasn't been a way to really merge the two in a way that that pleases a lot of people. And I think now we're really trying to see that. And that's why Karen has been really so helpful in helping to frame this conversation as head of the Urban Displacement Project, and saying, look, if we want to help solve these issues that we see in our community, where low income families can't afford to live here, heck, middle income families can't afford to live here. We're seeing a growing homeless problem. Unhoused people don't have a place to live, right? We see this, you know, I get emails every day saying, oh my gosh, can you check on this person? And that has everything to do with what we're talking about tonight. So, you know, the fact of the matter, we're talking a lot about zoning reform. The fact of the matter right now is we wouldn't be able to create affordable housing in half our city now. And yeah, we should figure out how to do it in a way that we're, in which we can maximize affordability and tenant protections, but we have to have that conversation because we're seeing super commuters, we're seeing teachers at my kids' school having to drive 2 hours to work in our community. And Janice, yes, you're right. Like we should look at vacant units. It's not there is no silver bullet. That's the one thing I've been saying to people with this zoning reform is that it is not going to solve nearly all of our problems, if only, right? But it's not. It really isn't. We have to have an all of the above approach, and one that we really listen to each other and have a community process. And so that's something that we're just really trying to reiterate. We're seeing 3.5 jobs to every one home. We're seeing widespread displacement, and we're seeing all available research around racial and economic segregation saying, you should look at a bunch of different policies, but you definitely should be looking at zoning policies. And then one last thing that I'll just add that, I know that this has been a conversation and you sort of alluded to it, Ruby, about, where does your funding come from? Which I always sort of giggle, some of my colleagues and I giggle about, because I use public financing. I could only accept $50 from a non-special interest individual in the city of Berkeley. So, but that's sort of because that's sort of packed into this. Why are you doing this? You must be doing this for some reason. And maybe my reason is different than yours, but we're doing this because we really do want to help people. And so I hope that helps answer some of the questions. And I'd love to hear from Karen because she's one of the preeminent experts on displacement. And so I'm going to tag Karen.
I'll take it. So I'm Karen Chappell. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley. And I also founded the Urban Displacement Project 6 years ago, really just to draw attention to the phenomenon of displacement, which is invisible to so many. So I just want to say a couple things to augment what others have said. So I tend to advocate for tenant protections, housing production, and housing preservation, all three. And it pisses people off because people want to pose it as a trade-off, as an either or, and I see it as a win-win-win. I see it as just like with climate change, where you wouldn't want to like choose solar or wind. You want to do everything you can. So you want to have a multi-pronged approach. So that's the stance I've always taken. And then the other thing that I'd bring in is I'm working in a different time frame. I'm a planner by training. So I think in terms of 30 or 50 years, always first. I mean, I try and think about today, but I'm always in the future. I'm in 2050 or 2070 right now. And so, I'm thinking about our grandkids, which drives my daughter crazy because then she thinks, I don't want to have all the grandkids, please, but I think we do need to think about the generations to come. So when people raise a question like, what's upzoning gonna do to land prices? To me, I say, what's upzoning gonna do to land prices in 2050 or 2070? And more than that, what is, if we fail to upzone, what are land prices going to look like in 2050 or 2070? Because we failed to upzone 30 years ago. We failed to upzone 50 years ago. We downzoned instead, and our land prices went crazy. So maybe we should try something a little different now. And just in terms of where my funding comes from, I'm mostly funded by the state. I get grants from ARB, from the Air Resources Board, from the Strategic Growth Council, and the Department of Housing and Community Development. And I fund a fabulous team of 25 UC Berkeley student researchers with that money.
So there's no
I don't think they're
magic
talking about you.
well for more housing like the vacant looking lots in West Berkeley or some of these commercial areas that are, well, I think they're actually serving for Christmas tree lots during the Christmas season, or the empty apartments that Janice and I think others have noticed around the city. They will not make much of an impact on the RENA allocation for Berkeley. Is that right?
The Christmas tree lots have been displaced from Berkeley.
Actually, I was being facetious, but in West Berkeley, people say, you know, there are so many vacant looking lots that could be used. And then also the question of whether there are these, maybe they're phantom uninhabited apartments that have not been counted. You know, there's a lot of misinformation, it seems, possible misinformation about setting the allocation. What is, how accurate it is.
Oh, so you're talking about the ABAG. Well, Jesse, do you want to take this, or do you want me to take an initial swing at it and then hand it over to you?
Why don't you take an initial swing and I'll,
Okay, so in terms of the criteria around the ABAG methodology, which I assume you're talking about, and let me just first apologize to any attendees. When I first was getting involved in the politics, I didn't know what people were talking about because of all of these acronyms. So I'm going to, and now I find myself falling into this and talking about ABAG and RENA and CEQA. So RENA is a Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and ABAG is the Association of Bay Area Governments. And so what I'm going to attempt to explain is how those numbers are derived for individual cities, and what is the criteria in which those numbers are adjusted. Okay, so the very first one is well, first of all, let me just first state that our next RENA cycle asks Berkeley to zone for 6,000 more units for a total of 9,000 units. And Jesse can talk a little bit more about that, but we talked a bit about it in our equitable zoning document and how it was sort of derived. But the first criteria is to increase the types of housing supply and mix of housing types and tenure and affordability. So just have a diversity of housing stock, because we've seen that there has been, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement that there's been a tremendous drop off in housing production in California. I don't think there's a ton of arguments around that. I see some nodding heads, but so to address this shortage of both, if people have disagreements around, whether we're only having a shortage of affordable housing, or rather if you have a shortage of all of the above. But I think just sort of in general, this shortage, I think people are in agreement about. And so that's sort of the first one. And then the second objective is to promote infill development and socioeconomic equity. So the infill development piece is around trying to address our climate change goals and making sure that people aren't, if they work in a particular area, that they can live there. And there's a lot of money for infrastructure if you create infill housing, and of course socioeconomic equity. We know a lot about rent burdens and how much people are paying for rents. We know that virtually every single person who earns extremely low income, and this is for your research, Karen, very low income, up to over 80% are rent burdened. So really trying to address that equity piece. And then the third objective is to promote that regional jobs housing relationship. So again, trying to, if people are commuting long distances, trying to figure out where we can put homes closer to where people work. And again, a lot of that has to do with the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act, and to address that concern. The fourth objective is to balance disproportionate household incomes. So, if essentially, if you're a wealthier city, you should zone for more low income homes, and vice versa. So, and then the fifth one, of course, is the affirmatively furthering fair housing. And that objective is to overcome patterns of segregation, both income and racial segregation. We could probably think of some communities that perhaps perpetuate that. And I'm not referring to Berkeley if you're thinking I am. I'm talking about some other places. I'm a politician. I'm not going to name names though, but places that need to do a better job of breaking down their arbitrary walls of segregation, both in terms of making it so expensive to live in maybe these very wealthy suburban areas throughout California, right? So that's the fifth criteria. And so that is sort of how this was determined. Did I do an okay job, Jesse? I'm going to hand it over to you and see if
the RHNA methodology. So the council of governments in each region, which is ABAG in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're the regional planning agency for the San Francisco Bay Area. We are responsible for developing the methodology that will then be used to assign a certain number of units to very low, moderate, and above moderate income households in each city, town, and county. And so there are really kind of two main inputs into the RHNA methodology. The first is the baseline data that is being used for the kind of growth assumptions. And so ABAG decided to use, after a very extensive public process, what's called the 2050 households baseline. And this is based on each jurisdiction's share of the region's total households in the year 2050, using the Plan Bay Area 2050 blueprint as a baseline, and taking into consideration the number of households that are currently living in a jurisdiction, as well as the number of households expected to be added over the next several decades. So state law requires that RHNA has to align with the regional plan, the SCS. And so one decision that ABAG made was to use the growth assumptions of the regional plan that we're developing right now, Plan Bay Area, as the baseline input into the RHNA methodology. Then we also apply what are called factors and weights, which are really kind of criteria to further refine the methodology and give priority to certain types of factors. So for example, for the very low and low income units, 70% of those units we propose to allocate to high opportunity areas. And high opportunity areas are based on the state tax credit allocation maps. And they are communities, and Professor Chappell can probably elaborate also. They're communities that have access to transit and schools, and literally high opportunity areas. And Berkeley has some high opportunity areas, namely certain parts of the Berkeley Hills that are classified as high opportunity areas. That's part of the reason why Berkeley's got such a larger RHNA allocation. We are also a transit-rich community. So we also got a greater number because we are many parts of our city are close to transit. So we prioritize proximity to transit, and we particularly prioritize access to high opportunity areas. And then we have to evaluate that RHNA methodology based on those 5 criteria that are prescribed in state law. And so we've developed a methodology. The state is evaluating whether it meets state statutory requirements. And then that's going to kick off a whole process where people can appeal that to ABAG if there are errors in calculation or the underlying data that's been provided to feed into the RHNA. But that's kind of the underlying assumptions that have gone into RHNA. There have been obviously criticisms by organizations like Livable California and the Embarcadero Institute about the way the state calculated the numbers. And I'll just say that the state calculated the numbers based on the law, based on what was adopted in Senate Bill 828.
You expect lawsuits to push back against what has come out of this process?
Well, I think if you look at what's happened in Southern California, there were a number of appeals of RHNA allocations. We haven't started that process. We're going to start the appeals process in May. But there are the state law has very narrow kind of criteria to grant an appeal. Like basically the underlying data has got to be inaccurate, or it's just because a jurisdiction doesn't agree with the RHNA allocation doesn't necessarily mean that ABAG is going to grant an appeal. So we have to evaluate each appeal on the basis of the 3 statutory requirements for appeals and make a decision. And then once we've dealt with all the appeals and any adjustments that need to be made based on those appeals, then ABAG will give final approval to the methodology sometime September, October of this year.
So Ruby, if I can get back to the introductions, I
Sure.
realized I never actually did introduce myself. So I am Janice Ching, and I'm part of the leadership of the Berkeley Neighborhoods Council. And the Berkeley Neighborhoods Council is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's dedicated to giving a voice to the many neighborhoods across our city. And neighbors come to us with land use issues, pollution issues, tenant right issues, all sorts of things. And we try to help them navigate through the very confusing and complicated city dynamics. I personally came to Berkeley in 1995, and first as a renter, and then as a condo owner, and then as a homeowner, as my husband and I raised our children. And it struck me going to all these neighborhood meetings that the one population that is really missing from the dialogue are families and people who are really struggling to get by. People who don't have the time and the energy because of their situation in life don't come to city council meetings, and they can't sit through hour-long ZAB meetings and things like that when an issue comes up in their neighborhood. So a lot of the voices that we hear at these meetings are young people, people who have flexible work schedules, people who can take time off, and a lot of retired people. I myself did not get involved in any city issues until my children were in high school and could take a little bit more care for themselves. And I can't imagine when I had 3 little kids under the age of 5 that I would have gone to a meeting. And I think Councilmember Kesarwani really showed that at the last city council meeting when, she obviously didn't have a babysitter. And so those are the voices that I feel often are missing from the conversation and need a little bit of help to get heard. And they get drowned out a lot by younger, more affluent people who have the ability to be heard. So that's one of the.
Sorry.
So that's one of the things that. Sorry, that's one of the things that the Berkeley Neighborhoods Council attempts to do, is to give a voice to some of the people that have a harder time being heard.
What is the representation? Is this all neighborhoods of Berkeley are represented on the council? How are how's the leadership chosen? How are the priorities set? I don't really know a lot about the Berkeley Neighborhoods Council.
Okay, so I forgot to also mention about the funding, because that was something that was asked that we say. And we have a very small budget. We run on a shoestring of donations, and we don't charge neighborhood groups to come to our meetings or anything like that. It's all voluntary donations. And we only, all the donations that we get are from individuals, and we try to make sure that everyone that we are speaking to are residents of our city. So people hear about us through word of mouth. Sometimes council members refer people to us. Sometimes commission members refer groups to us. And, I'll give you an example of, one of the things I wanted to bring up was what Senator Wiener said about the ADUs and how we can use ADUs in the ministerial approval. Well, one of the groups that came to us most recently is a group that was rallied around a ADU on Harper Street that was granted ministerial approval by our city planning department. And they did not make the tenants in the apartment buildings aware that construction was going to happen. They did not ensure access to the existing apartments on the property. And luckily, the mayor was at one of our meetings when this item was brought up and was able to step in and help a disabled neighbor who could not make it up the ramp to his own apartment. So that's the things that the neighbors are afraid of, is that when you grant ministerial approval, there's a lot of unintended consequences. And, that's an important thing that we hope that our city leaders will take a look at.
It seems like a particularly useful thing, though, that you've started the process of fashioning the permitting process so far in advance of the deadline. That should help a lot in gathering as much input from the community as possible. And
yeah, I think that there's a misunderstanding too, that a lot of homeowners don't want housing, and that we have not found to be true. One of the first projects I got involved in, the neighbors came together and actually supported more density if they could get more affordability in the units. And one of the things we fight time after time are property development groups that try to wiggle through every loophole to not pay to the affordable housing mitigation fee and not pay or not include units on site that, that would really help our low and very low income residents. So that is one of the things that we push for.
I apologize for interrupting. When she said council, I thought she was asking a council, like city council question. So I'm sorry, Janice. I apologize for interrupting.
Fine.
So on that note, one thing I'll just add, there's a lot of talk around ministerial approval. That was not something that was in the final version of what we passed at council. A couple of things I do want to talk about, though. One, and I'll just add that I really appreciated that Rashi was juggling not only her children at that meeting. I know that she had an important community meeting as well. And this, you're absolutely right, Janice, in that we want to make sure that we are hearing from a wide variety of community stakeholders, not the people who can only come to the meetings, not the people who can, engage online, but hear from a wide variety of people. So I certainly share that. One thing about ministerial approval, we were previously talking about SB 35, and that has been the biggest driver of affordable housing creation in the state right now. And so Scott has left, but in Berkeley, it is, as Scott mentioned, it's cut down the time to approve affordable housing. So we've seen more affordable housing quicker because of ministerial approval. Now, when understandably people get nervous when, you mentioned the ADU law through the state and sort of what a challenge that is, right? You have to get it right if you're going to have ministerial approval. And, so there are some circumstances that I think, and this is not what we passed, this is my own personal opinion. I'm not speaking for Jesse. I'm not speaking for anybody. except for myself. But I think there might merit a situation with very clearly defined rules. If someone maybe wanted to, I've heard from people in my district that they want to duplex their house, for instance. And the question is, should a neighbor be able to stop that from happening? That's the conversation I want to have. Of course, that then leapt to like, oh my gosh, there's going to be, over the counter, 100-unit buildings, but that was never our conversation when we're talking around gentle density and missing middle housing. Is just where might that be appropriate? But I also understand that is understandably frightening because of our history and with planning. And you just brought up an example of what has happened in our recent past and our distant past. So I see that, and I acknowledge that. I do think that then at a time it might be a worthwhile conversation to say, when might it be appropriate to speed certain elements up, right? I also hear as a council member from a lot of people saying, oh my gosh, I've had to deal with the planning and permitting, and oh my goodness, has taken so long. And that ministerial piece is trying to address that complaint in a way. I mean, there are other things too, but that is just simply what we're trying to get at. It's like, how can we streamline something in a very reasonable way with very clear expectations? But again, that is not what we ended up passing. But whenever people hear about ministerial approval or by right, they think and I'm not saying anybody here, but they go automatically to the worst possible vision of whatever. And really, we just wanted to open the door to a conversation of, when might it be appropriate to say, you know what, maybe I don't need to get my neighbor to weigh in on, if I just am going to duplex my home and have my grandkids move in. So that's sort of what I was trying to get at. But Karen, you had mentioned something, how you have done some research on vacancies. I know that was a question that was posed.
Before we go there, can I introduce myself? Because I haven't had a chance to introduce myself, and so I don't want to be bypassed, if that's okay.
I'm sorry. Things have gotten I have to apologize, got kind of out of hand here.
And then Jesse too. Yeah, absolutely. Please go for it.
Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. I'm Paola Laverde. I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank the League of Women Voters to inviting me here as a representative from Latinos Unidos de Berkeley. Very proud member. I'm also a member of the Rent Board. I'm also a tenant advocate. I've been living in Berkeley now for 20 years. I'm a Colombian immigrant, and along with the mayor, I make up 11% of the Latinos who live here in Berkeley. A little bit about myself. I came to Berkeley because I was Ellis evicted from my fourplex in San Francisco. Then nearly 2 years later, in the fourplex I was living in, I was 6 months pregnant. Brand new property owners came in and harassed us out. Put a hole about this big in our kitchen wall. And so we had to leave. For 14 years, we lived in a golden duplex with a landlord who did not charge market rate housing, but did little to improve the property, despite the fact that after 14 years, we paid over $200,000 in rent, because that's what, if you pay rent every year, it is a huge accumulation. It is a big profit maker for people who own property. And today I'm one of tens of thousands of Berkeley tenants and millions of Californians who are rent burdened. I currently pay more than 50% of my paycheck every month to be in rent to my landlord. So I'm very excited here to give voice to the people who are like me. Our housing crisis is one of affordability. We're told, we have a housing crisis. We have a housing crisis. We have to build, build, build. The state is saying we have to build. Yet in SB 828, it says that a healthy rental housing market is one that has a higher vacancy rate of 5%. And at a report that was given in February 2019, the assessment of vacancies, Berkeley had a vacancy rate of 7.4% in 2017. We had 3,622 vacant units. In 2018, that number had gone up to 3,754. So it brought the vacancy rate up to 8%. So, but we have a housing crisis, we're told. We have a housing crisis. We have to build. It's not one of, and it's an affordability crisis. Janice brought up the issues of vacant units. This building right here that you're looking at is 1915 Delaware Street. It is a 10-unit apartment building that has been empty since 2005. 2005, it's been empty. Okay, in City of Berkeley, on rent control buildings at all, multi-unit buildings, we have 111 empty buildings. And unfortunately, I don't have in front of me the total of, and this is just rent control. The total of not available for rent units, but it does involve 536 buildings that have empty units. And that's why, I'm very excited to be a rent board commissioner and very excited to live in a city where the voters understand the importance of rent control and understand the importance of keeping track of our rental market. Measure MM was passed overwhelmingly by voters in Berkeley in November, which now requires all rental units, including single family homes, which there are more than 5,000 single family homes that are rentals in Berkeley. That must register now with the rent board. It's very important to understand that the upzoning that is being put before us does not require affordability, And that's what's so disturbing to me as a renter that can never dream of buying a house, just like the mayor. I mean, I can't dream of buying a house. And God knows if even in one of those condos that goes up in the fourplexes, I can dream of buying one of those because those are not going to be affordable, because a developer who comes in and buys a plot of land that costs $1 million and now puts in four pieces of housing on there, they're going to want to, get as much money as they can for their investment in that property, because housing is a commodity. Housing is a commodity, and developers and investors want to make as much money as possible, because we see how much money you can make on rental housing. So I just want to bring that voice in, and to make sure, when we talk about opportunity zones, when in February, in a month, we've never seen how fast a housing issue has gone through the city of Berkeley. In a month, we have gone from declaring a resolution that we're going to ban exclusionary housing to the point where, we are now talking about and pushing on to the planning committee and the commission and the planning department what we're going to do. But I do want to say that using a race as a way to, upzoning, and now we're going to we're going to deal with our race issues by, letting people build in areas that are most economically impacted, and allow that building up in, in the Alaline corridor where we know that we were redlined, where we know that we have people who have low income, and they're the ones who are going to be most impacted, because we're seeing it right now. We're seeing it right now that people in renters in single family homes are, and I'm seeing it with the Berkeley Tenants Union. We're getting emails that they're saying, my landlord wants to raise the rent on us and we have to leave. I mean, the vice mayor just said people have to leave because housing is a commodity, and there's nothing being done to deal with that issue. That's why I would encourage the vice mayor and the mayor to really take serious into consideration the rent board's 5 points that they offered to you in a letter that all the rent board commissioners, because we as rent board commissioners, we represent the whole city. I alone have tens of thousands of people who voted for me when I ran for office. And so we all represent voices of tenants and of small property owners, to look at the points that we suggested to deal with speculation, to look at taking data and to see how the upzoning is going to impact our community, to look at making sure that those anti-speculation, real serious anti-speculation recommendations are taken into effect, because and not to demolish any rent controlled units. So that's where I stand. That we need affordability. We need affordability now, not for, so thank you.
I just want to say one thing. I also represent the whole city. Berkeley voters last election, 36,000, the largest number of people who ever voted for a mayoral candidate. Represent them. So I represent tenants. I represent homeowners, property owners, homeless people, students, the wide breadth of the community. And I just will say, Commissioner Laverde, we did take very seriously the recommendations the rent board put forward. As you know, I'm a very strong, passionate advocate for renters. And I do believe we've incorporated most of the rent board's recommendations. But I guess I have a question for you, which is the fact currently is that multifamily housing is prohibited in roughly 49% of the city. Tenants can't live in 49% of the city. And so I understand your concerns around allowing a greater, market rate housing in currently gentrifying communities. And I think that's a conversation we should have. I'm obviously very concerned about potential displacement impact, but are you opposed to allowing multifamily housing in parts of our city which are right now prohibited to allow tenants?
Not at all. Not at all. I've never said I'm against affordable upzoning. I've never said it. I want to make it very clear. I'm not opposed to that. What I'm opposed to is market rate housing being built. We have done 128% of our market rate housing. We do not need any more market rate housing. What we need is affordable housing at all levels. The rent board suggested that those fourplexes that go up, you have one unit for anybody for below 80 AMI, and then no higher than 150 AMI for the other units. We want affordable housing. That's what we want, is affordable housing, because people can't afford to live in Berkeley, because
So,
it's
Paula,
commodification.
I agree with you. And I think that we want to create affordable. I think this is one of the areas where we're in agreement. And the fact of the matter is again, it's essentially illegal in half of the city. And on top of that, I think there's a philosophical question to be had around whether non-subsidized housing is appropriate. And so let's just talk about that for a second. So you don't want any market rate housing. On the other hand, the state is telling us now, let me pull up what are our RHNA numbers. Our state is saying, oh my goodness, you have to create 3,664, or actually probably we may have to include some of that, the moderate piece too, maybe even more than that. So they're saying you have to create 4,000 units. So that's what we have to do. But then there's also this philosophical question about who gets that affordable housing, who has access to that subsidized housing. And I agree. If I had a magic wand, I would say, let's create all those units overnight. But the fact of the matter is, and again, this is kind of challenging, is that one unit of subsidized affordable housing is $660,000. If we were going to create as much affordable housing as we need, and I'm in full agreement with you, that is more than our entire budget, in the billions. I still want that to happen. And we have said that we want to maximize affordability. I know Councilmember Taplin is putting forward an affordable housing overlay. You talk about affordable housing, that's something that he's put forward that's supported by Patrick Condon. And there's also social housing that's moving forward. But the fact of the matter is there's a few different things. One, we hear a lot about gentrification and gentrifiers coming into our city.
It's true.
A lot of those homes that are taken up by gentrifiers are homes where we're seeing people displaced. Do we want them to take those homes from individuals, or should we create homes so they don't displace? And Karen's done a lot of research around homes and what leads to displacement. Of course, affordable housing, and Karen, I don't want to speak for you. You're awfully quiet. You don't want to get involved in this, but of course, affordable housing does it the best. But market rate housing also stems displacement. And on top of that, in Berkeley, people don't know that students, the vast majority of students, cannot access affordable housing, affordable, subsidized housing. So that means they're moving into those homes, into those apartments, displacing individuals. So you're right. Does Cal have to do more? Absolutely. But I fundamentally disagree, and I would say a lot of research also fundamentally disagrees that the only way we're going to solve our problems is by subsidized housing. But I know Karen can speak a lot more about displacement.
I want to just add one point here. No, you've said a lot. I just want to talk a little bit about housing costs. As you said, the $660,000 to build a new unit versus housing, affordable housing preservation. And I think we just don't talk enough about it. So 3/4 of our affordable housing in California comes from naturally occurring affordable housing. It's older housing that has become more affordable over time. And this missing middle legislation is an opportunity really to create that type of housing, because what will it do? It will facilitate taking big single family homes and turning them into fourplexes. And the study in Portland of doing upzoning, missing middle housing, found that that was the best way, the most efficient way to create affordable housing from the missing middle legislation was to convert existing buildings. And so if we can do that, if we can even make bigger houses into duplexes and then put 2 ADUs in the backyard, that would be an affordable way to get the missing middle.
So, you know,
Are public banks starting to help with this problem of building more affordable housing? I understand that in some other sectors, public banks are could be helpful in reducing costs.
Well, I'll just say we don't have a public bank in California yet, but there is legislation which I very strongly support to create a California public bank and even a East Bay public bank. You know, there are community development financing institutions, CDFIs, that do provide you know, financing to support affordable housing. And a lot of these are, you know, leveraging also major commercial banks, Community Reinvestment Act requirements. So while there's not like a public bank, there's CDFIs, and there's also a number of different state funds like low-income housing tax credits that the state allocates, which nonprofit developers are able to apply for and access to be able to help fill the gap and be able to finance affordable housing projects. So it's really a mix of city subsidy, private sector, and usually state or federal subsidy that comes together to form that budget that nonprofit developers are able to use to finance affordable housing.
I want to respond to what Professor Chappell said about the fourplexes lowering the price by having 4 units. It really sounds very sensible that if you take a property and you build extra units on it, that it would bring the cost down. But what I've seen, you know, the neighborhood, what we see from a neighborhood view of the world, I live in South Berkeley, and right down the street from me, they did exactly that. They took a lot that had an existing home on it, and they built a triplex. So they put 2 other houses on the lot. And when these units came up for sale, they each sold for $1 million. And so you had the median home price in South Berkeley is a little bit over it's like 1.2 or so million now, I think. And, then they just take this house, they buy it for 1.2, and they build these 3 houses and sell them for this exact same amount, times 3. So how does the person who's looking to buy a more affordable house, if we don't put some kind of a cap on what people can sell for, what's going to prevent everyone from doing that? That's one thing. And then the second point is, if you allow that kind of fourplex housing, when I sell my house and some family wants to buy my house, how are they ever going to compete with a developer or a REIT, a real estate investment trust, that wants to buy my property and build a 3-story apartment building right behind my house and have 6 units in that? How can anybody purchase a house?
So, okay, thank you, Janice. So I'm trying to get all the questions. So you're wondering about around the speculation measures? Okay. So I think that's a really important question and something that we're asking our planning commission in consultation with our staff to really wrap their heads around. One thing that, just to alleviate some concerns is that one is we want to make sure, you had mentioned like a 3-story house next to yours. And so just in terms of design and context, that's also something that we want our planning commission to dive into and figure out, what's appropriate for our neighborhoods, and, how do you define appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. But in talking with, and perhaps Karen, you might have more information on this because you've been studying it more. In the conversations that I have had with people who are doing this type of work, is that you have to have, like, if you are going to upzone one area which is illegal, like a spot zone, you're going to see a big increase in what that area would cost. But if you have more equitable zoning and you have more parcels that have this parameter around it, around the zoning being raised by a unit or 2 units, then you're going to see that price dispersion throughout the whole city, right? So that's why it's important to really pursue an equitable approach in this manner. Also, what I've heard is that, and I think J.K. Deneen wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle, is that right now there's not really like the margins to have a big developer and who's going to capitalize on this type of speculation. I that is not an answer for me, though. Just to let you know, I'm not taking that as the gospel or whatever, because this is something I really want the Planning Commission to dive into. But they're really not seeing the margins in doing something like that, buying a $1.4 million home, putting $2 million into it, and not it doesn't seem like it's that wise of an investment. But this is something that we have asked, because it's very important to us, for our staff and planning commission to dig into, because we do need more details. But in general, we have seen, in looking at that displacement risk analysis in Portland, we've seen positive impacts for communities in terms of levels of affordability, from 21 to 28% with the displacement risk analysis in Portland.
Well, I think it's important for you to know that neighbors have come to us at the Berkeley Neighborhoods Council and told us that they've already received flyers in the mail and phone calls about selling their homes, that they're already being approached by investment entities asking to buy their homes.
Well, I think that is incredibly important information to have, and I welcome you to send it to us. And because this is exactly why we're setting off on an approximately 2-year process. So that's something else that I really wanted to talk about. None of this is happening overnight. yes, the conversation has really changed over the past couple of years, right? We talked about studying missing middle housing in 2019. There was a lot of talk in the national election around zoning. And so we said, okay, well, um, if President Biden says he's going to give communities additional funding for infrastructure to look at our exclusionary zoning laws, maybe this is a conversation we should begin. And that's really what we tried to do, is begin this conversation. By no means, and we did not mandate an outcome, as you'll see. We did not mandate an outcome. We said, let's figure out a way to equitably zone our city, and try to ensure that we're seeing more equity there, and trying to accommodate these growing housing allocations that we see. So this is something that is very much at the beginning of the process. Always was going to be a community input process. Any zoning revisions, heck, we put, you can ask the mayor, we put things to the planning commission 3 years ago, we haven't gotten back. But it's always a very intensive process, especially with the housing element. We're required by law to reach out to the most affected communities, go through significant fire safety analysis. All of this is a very intensive, inclusive process. Even without us explicitly stating it, but it was very important that we made sure people understood that it was an inclusive community process. And I want to thank the mayor for also really helping to articulate that message. And I want to be mindful of the time, Ruby. It's
so fascinating. I lost track of
I
time.
know my kids have been coming up earlier and giving me cookies, so I probably should put them to bed. But I want to thank you so much for having me here this evening, and thank you for the conversation. So
Thank you. Thank all of you. Yeah, Janice, Paula, yeah,
I
Mayor.
just want to add one more thing, if you allow me to. So I just want to remind that, the city everywhere can build ADUs. So ADUs can go up everywhere. There are renters or tenants who live in single family homes throughout those areas that they're not allowed to upzone, and that will be impacted by upzoning. And we're going to see, and we're seeing now, a major displacement of tenants who are going to be kicked out of these single family homes, because they're, the business owners are going to seek ways to increase the bang for their buck. So it is something that I want to make sure we are aware of the displacement that's going to happen of families that currently rent in Berkeley. And it's a shame, because the upzoning, although we need the housing, with the state mandates we need the housing, we're going to see a massive displacement of people. We're gonna see a lot of more people disappear from our community, more families. So thank you very much for the time and the opportunity to participate.
I have a very quick question for the mayor, and I'm wondering, what is the deadline for building our RHNA allocation?
Well, we have to have a compliant housing element by 2023. So, assuming that the numbers are at 9,000, roughly 9,000, we have to show that we have what's called the zone capacity in the city to accommodate those 9,000 units, either through existing zoning, or we have to make modifications to zoning to allow that number of units. So, part of what we're doing at ABAG is we're providing consultants, technical assistance, and direct funding that we've gotten from the state of California to help local governments do this important work that they're going to have to do over the next year. The reason we started early in Berkeley is because we felt that we wanted to start the process sooner, so that we can begin what we know is going to be a very long and important community process, to have the conversations around where is it appropriate in our community to grow, and do that in an inclusive way that actually takes into consideration the input of those neighborhoods affected and those stakeholders that will be impacted. So that's what we're committed to doing, and you all will be very key parts of that conversation. And thank you.
When they talk about SB 35 kicking in if we don't meet our RHNA goals, and they talk about imposing state control, when does that actually kick in?
Well, every year local governments have to provide reports to the state Housing Community Development Department about your compliance with RENA. And so, we've had to move pretty quickly to implement SB 35, but the reporting that's done to the state and where you are at in meeting your above moderate or low income category based on those reports will inform whether the streamlining provisions do take effect or not. So in Berkeley, we are, like 140% above our moderate income allocation for this current RENA cycle. And so therefore, we don't have, the SB 35 streamlining does not apply to above moderate, but it does apply to low income.
So when I looked at the RENA numbers online, it said, it was something about our vision for 2050. Is that what we're looking at?
Well, as I explained, and I do also have to go, that's in my sort of explanation of RENA, we are using as part, well, there are two things we got to do. We have right now, ABAG is doing the RENA, which we have to do every 8 years based on the numbers the state gives us of how many units we have to plan for our region. And then we're also required every 4 years to update our regional transportation plan and our sustainable community strategy, which is required by Senate Bill 375. And so we're also in that process of updating our regional plan, which we're calling Plan Bay Area 2050. State law requires that the RENA has to align with our sustainable community strategy, or SCS. And so what ABAG decided to do was to use the household growth assumptions in the year 2050 as the input into our RENA, because we want to make sure ultimately that the RENA reflects the long-term growth pattern or growth assumptions that we're projecting for the region. So that is the input, the underlying data that we're using, as part of the methodology. And we're also still in the process of finalizing Plan Bay Area 2050. And we encourage everyone to go to abag.ca.gov to follow the public meetings and many opportunities for public input to weigh in on this important process. And with that, I have to go. I'm sorry, but thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks a lot. And thanks to our facilitators, our Zoom facilitators from the league.
Thank you very much, Ruby, and to the League of Women Voters. This has been very an interesting conversation.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Great to hear all of
Professor
the views.
Thanks, Paula.